You may recall in October of 1994, a story out of South Carolina gripped the entire nation. This was before social media, before we could see all the updates around the world every 3 seconds. A young mother, her name was Susan Smith, she stood before cameras, crying her eyes out, pleading for the safe return of her two missing sons. She claimed that she'd been carjacked by a black man who drove off with her children still strapped in their car seats. For 9 days, this was the headline in all of the national news, and America believed her, only to find out it was all a lie. The truth was far darker. At the heart of this was one of humanity's oldest temptations, lust. At the bottom of the John D. Long Lake, police found Smith's Mazda. Inside were her two boys, 3-year-old Michael, 14-month-old Alex. They were strapped in their car seats. The car was upside down. One tiny hand pressed against the window. Investigators later showed that it took 6 minutes for that car to sink with both beautiful boys strapped in their car seats, alive, awake, happy, healthy, as they went to the bottom of the lake. 6 minutes of terror for two children who trusted their mother. So why did she do it? Prosecutors say that Susan Smith was having an affair with the wealthy son of her boss, and he told her very plainly, "It won't work because I don't want children." For him, she was exciting, attractive, desirable, but only if the boys were out of the picture. And so the prosecutors argued Susan picked him over her boys. She chose lust over life. The sin lust, the definition of the English word lust in both Hebrew and Greek, is to deeply desire something or someone that is not yours. It's an intense, often uncontrolled desire for something. In this case, it led to selfish, unconsidered, immoral actions. This is the why behind the crime, the motive. I'm Ashley Willcott. As a TV anchor, a former judge, a former trial attorney, I would say that almost every single case I've ever seen intersects with one of the 7 deadly sins: pride, greed, wrath, envy, lust, gluttony, and sloth, the opposite of the 7 heavenly virtues, temptations that taken too far turn deadly. This week, we break down the case of Susan Smith and how and why her lust for her affair caused her to murder her own 2 children. A little later, I am joined by the prosecutor, the elected solicitor who tried the case against Susan Smith, and we will go deep on the how and why lustful desires caused a mother to kill her own children. Let's get into it. This is the Deadly 7. Susan Smith's trial in 1995 was a national sensation. Prosecutors asked for the death penalty. The defense said, on the other hand, no, she's suicidal, mentally broken. She meant to die with her kids, but stepped out of the car at the last moment. Here's what happened. On October 25th of 1994, we know now, Susan Smith drove her 2 sons, 3-year-old Michael, 14-month-old Alex, to John D. Long Lake in Union, South Carolina. She then lets the car roll down a boat ramp into the lake while the 2 boys are strapped into their car seats. Both children drown as the car takes approximately 6 minutes to sink to the bottom of the lake. Later that night, Susan Smith reports to the police that she was carjacked by a black man at a traffic light who drove away with her children still strapped inside her Mazda. She claims that that man forced her out of the car and left her behind. She continued this lie for 9 days on all of the national media fronts. She's crying. She's making emotional pleas for her son's safe return, knowing where they were and what she had done. This story was so big at the time, not only was it a national headline, it also made international headlines. The investigators, in the meantime, they were suspicious. during the course of their investigation. Of course, they were investigating what she said happened, but they also noticed these inconsistencies. Number one, the traffic light where she claimed the carjacking happened wouldn't have turned red unless another car was present, and it stayed green. But Smith said there were no other cars present. She stopped at the red light. She was carjacked. That light was green, not red. Number two, law enforcement knew that carjackers usually want the car. They don't want children in the car. So their question was, why would a carjacker let Susan, the mother, go, but keep the two children in the car? It didn't make sense to law enforcement. Susan Smith was questioned intensely, and she finally confessed on November 3rd that she had rolled her car into the lake with her children inside. She did plead not guilty, so she did have to have a trial, or rather the state had to have a trial in order to have her convicted. After she confessed, the divers did recover the vehicle from the lake, at which time they found exactly what they expected based on her confession. Michael and Alex were inside their car seats. The car had been upside down. One of the little hands was pressed on the glass of the window when they pulled that car out of the lake. The motive? Susan Smith was involved with a wealthy man, the son of her boss, who ended the relationship because he didn't want children. It was a horrific case as it unfolded. In the end, the jury did convict Susan Smith for the murders of both of her sons. The jury, though, spared her the death penalty. Instead, they sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole in 30 years. Susan Smith is now 53 years old. Susan Smith recently came up for parole for the very first time because she has now served 30 years in jail. She appeared on video, and she was questioned about lots of things. One of the things was the wasted police resources that her lies created. And this was her answer. She answered softly, and I quote, "I was just scared. I didn't know how to tell them. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough." In her final plea to the parole board, she invoked her faith. And I quote, "God has forgiven me, and I ask that you show me that same mercy." There were about 15 people in addition to the parole board during the hearing: prosecutors, law enforcement, her ex-husband, David Smith. They had photos of Michael and Alex pinned to their jackets, and they begged the parole board to deny parole. David Smith was the father of both of these children. Through tears, here's what he told the board in part. "This wasn't a tragic mistake. Susan had free choice. It's just not enough. I'll be here at every hearing to make sure my sons are never forgotten." The prosecutor that will be joining us, Tommy Pope, he told the board that Susan's crime was selfish at its core. In his words, and I quote, "A horrible, horrible choice to choose a man over her family." Another prosecutor, Kevin Brackett, was there, and he said the case traumatized not only the family, but the entire country, while Smith's false accusation against a Black man harmed innocent people in her own community. And keep this in mind, even during her years in prison, she revealed the same hunger she had for intimacy and validation. She had sex with guards. She exchanged letters with men who promised her homes and money and affection. She wanted a sugar daddy, and she courted attention from anyone who she thought might be a sugar daddy. Lust, as the prosecutors argued, was always Susan Smith's driving force. In their eyes, Susan Smith spent 30 years rehearsing her story, but never truly showing remorse for her two children. 3 decades after choosing lust over love, passion over parenthood, and desire over duty, the question remains, should Susan Smith ever walk free? Or is the price of mercy too high when two young lives were drowned by their own mother in the name of lust? The parole board denied her parole, and she will be up for parole every 2 years moving forward. Joining me now, Tommy Pope. Such a treat, Tommy. You have provided so much great analysis on air for us with trials, but this one is a little bit different. Susan Smith is one that you actually prosecuted successfully. No surprise, you're one heck of a trial attorney. But let me ask you, when Susan Smith, we learned, drove her two sons, it was a 3-year-old named Michael, a 14-month-old Alex, into the John D. Long Lake in Union, South Carolina. Take us back, Tommy. Where were you when you very first received news of the actual crime?
So 9 days prior to us realizing she had actually put the boys in the lake, she had claimed that she was carjacked. I was the solicitor. That's the district attorney here in South Carolina. I was elected district attorney. And I was actually at trial at York County, which is my bigger county. So I had York County and I had Union County. And so each day I would get contacted by the SLED agents. That's our state law enforcement division. They would kind of give me an update because, I worked at SLED also. And just based on my law enforcement experiences, I didn't think that an African American carjacked and took the kids. Traditionally they take the car, they may take your money, they may assault a female sexually, but in the hierarchy of carjacking, it's way down. So Susan spent the better part of 9 days in front of the national media. To give it some type of context, this was back when OJ was going on. And so it was really at the advent of even it's like court TV, when people were really following cases, and every day was begging for the return of the children. And then, unfortunately, that night I got the call that she had finally confessed, and were in the bottom of John D. Long Lake, strapped in their car seat.
I remember watching this because she was all over the national news and she was crying. She was pleading for the safe return of her children. In those 9 days, I felt like America believed her. America, you may have known better because of your expertise, your experience with law enforcement, but America believed her story of a Black man drove off with her car with the two children strapped in the back. So now walk us through the confession. Did she just show up and say, hey, by the way, I want to admit that I really did this?
No, ma'am. So what happens is anytime you have a situation like this, and unfortunately we see them all too frequently, a good law enforcement investigation, really it's twofold. You follow whatever leads that, she gives you. In other words, they were looking for the car and looking for the African American and doing all of those things, searching for the boys. But you're running a dual investigation where you look where it would most logically be, which sadly with children, more often than not, you look inside the family. And so that's what was occurring there. So you had counter investigations. They would come in daily. Of course, the father, David Smith, Susan and David were somewhat estranged, but David stepped up. As soon as the kids were missing from night one, when Susan runs to the house claiming there's a carjacker, where she'd actually just run from John D. Long Lake, David's by her side. Susan's enjoying the media, and David looks like the guy that you told your two kids had just been kidnapped. And so he stood by her side the whole time. And ultimately, it played out that her story didn't add up. The biggest piece more than anything was the intersection where she initially said it happened had one of the pressure plate lights. In other words, the only reason it would ever not be green going this way, the only reason you'd ever have to stop was if a car came in on the side road. And she claimed nobody was at the intersection. Well, technically she would never have had to stop because the light wouldn't have been red. That little piece actually helped kind of unravel it. And ultimately law enforcement was able to kind of put her in a position where her story didn't add up. And she, the media helped. The media, asking the tough questions. I always remember Katie Couric asking her, and, suddenly it wasn't fun. It was all fun when you were just asking me and helping me and I'm the princess or I'm the victim. But once they started kind of accusing her, I think that all that pressure helped squeeze it into her admitting it.
Do you think she literally stood on the boat ramp and watched her car with her 2 kids in their car seats, alive, awake, healthy, just roll into the lake?
So we always say the best lies are laced in some truth. And I remember one time she talked about the carjacker taking her kids, and she could hear him screaming for her as the carjacker drove off. Well, I think she probably did hear that. We actually tested a similar make and model vehicle and her vehicle, after the fact for flotation characteristics, because I just wanted to know from a case standpoint what she could have known, would have known. Was it too late? Because I always say if she'd have run that house and say, I made a horrible mistake, I was suicidal, it doesn't mean she wouldn't be held responsible, but you and I wouldn't be talking about it 30 years later. And so she,
Right.
when we tested the vehicle, it floated for about 6 minutes. And um, my argument's always been if she, because the defense said botched suicide. And I don't believe that for a second because she wasn't wet. If you've run the car in and then panic, that's one thing. If she tried to get the kids, that's one thing. The car floated for 6 minutes. And so she could have at least tried to rescue him. She didn't. And so I think she rolled them down. And of course, and this will roll into what we're going to talk about today, but her wedding album, her wedding dress was in the car. The kids were in the car. In her mind, it was a nice, neat package to remove her marriage and all the responsibilities and all the things tied with that. I always say if possible, she'd have had David Smith, the father, in the trunk too, and just, I mean, it's almost like I call it shaking the Etch-a-Sketch. She'd, been able to do it over again. And I truly believe that's what she thought that night.
It's so diabolical, and for me, Tommy, you know where I stand with kids especially, but to think of, 6 minutes of those kids, in the car, can't get out, mom's not in the car, and then to drown. To me, my biggest fear is drowning. They say it's peaceful. How do they know? Because you're dead if you've drowned, but I think it's one of the worst ways you could possibly ever die, and these 2 children suffered that. One of the you're right, lust. I wanna talk about the 7 deadly sins because we know she was having an affair with a man who didn't want kids. And so I agree with you. I think she thought, "Let me wipe all of this away. Let me get rid of this prior life, and then, of course, he'll want me, and I can." What did she delusionally think I can live happily ever after with him?
Well, it was ironic, and I want to back up on the drowning. So we literally put a video camera. It wasn't a reenactment, it was a testing. I wanted to know what we could know. But I remember when that car sunk, and I think I've shared this with you before, it basically floats and curves and then noses down. And in the video, thinking, now granted, it was night, but thinking what the boys would have experienced, the water, like you said, I mean, it'll make you short of breath if I describe it to you, but the water rising up, coming toward, and ultimately covering the camera. We presented that in the courtroom, and it would take your breath away. We had to present it for the judge, and because we had to do the Dahlberg, the scientific aspects of it. Susan's watching it, and she's over there giggling and writing and playing around. The jury comes in. Now it's turned away from her. She can't see it. You can see the jury's faces, just like your reaction a second ago. Think it's almost like you can't breathe. And she was crying, man. That tells me a lot about her character. But going into the relationship aspect, the night that she drowned the kids, she had on Tom Finley was the name of the boyfriend. She had his Auburn sweatshirt on. That may or may not be of any instance, but she told her husband David, even that night, she said, now, while we're looking for the boys, don't be upset, but Tom Finley's probably going to come by and check on me. And I remember David sharing that with me. And over the years, I always say I've become like a late psychologist, I guess, for talking about it so much. But so many people said, such beautiful kids. If you want the other guy, just give your kids away. There's a way to deal with this. But if you give your kids away, you're a bad mother. But if the bad guy takes your kids, you're a victim, which then increases the likelihood for Prince Charming, Tom Finley, to come back into your rescue. So, Again, as diabolical as that sounds, on sub level where she mentally articulated it or displayed it out, it was all she truly had convinced herself that suddenly Tom was going to come back. And he wrote the letter to her that said, I don't want children. The truth is, he took the coward's way out. He had had relations with most of the women in the factory or in the business. And so it was really just kind of like I say, the coward's way out to say, Ashley, we've had our fun. It really was, I'm going to blame it on the kids because it's easier to escape.
Yeah, what he was saying is, "I don't want you, Susan Smith." Maybe he saw something in her to know she was crazy, and I use that term lightly. That's not a legal term, but she certainly had her issues, and I would agree with you. It says so much. I always look at these crimes as a rational, reasonable person, and that's what you can't do because it won't make sense to you. But when you look at someone like her and you describe her behaviors like you just did in court, where the first time she sees the reenactment, she's giggling and laughing and making notes. And then the second time, because the jury's in, she's crying. That speaks about her as a person. She's not reasonable, rational, right? That says so much about her. But I have to ask you in that reenactment, I understand from following the trial that the boys were found in the car strapped in her seats, but that Tommy, they were upside down. Is that accurate? And how did that happen?
Well, it was ironic. So, people speculate so many different things. One is that law enforcement had found the car previously because they dove John D. Long Lake fairly early because it was such close proximity. Even if you're thinking she got carjacked somewhere in that area, you're thinking, well, maybe they could have gone down that way. We didn't know this, but it happened again with the test vehicle and Susan's vehicle. When we did the testing, it went down the ramp. Logic would tell you it would be straight down there at the end. What it actually did was made a J. It makes that J over toward the dam. It does what's called turtling. And what it does is the car goes slowly nose down. That's where I got the part I'm talking about where you see the water come up through the vents. And then it floats to the bottom and can turn upside down. But as far as any upside down, it would have been by virtue that the car was upside down. When they were removed from the lake, and I was down that night, they literally were strapped in their car seats. And it's almost barbaric because you think something as sacred as basically two kids' graves, but literally hooked to a tow cable with a wrecker and pulling that car out, and they were both in their car seats. And I just remember my oldest son was around that age at the time, and I always remember as a parent what a pain it is to deal with car seats. For me to take it out and put it in your car, move it back to my car, and strap it in and make sure it's there. And the irony of how hard we work to keep them safe for that to be really an assistant and implement of their death is just, even more tragic.
And I think sometimes listeners and viewers give short shrift to, oh, he's elected DA, he's a politician. No, 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 no. Number one, you're a trial attorney and a good one. Number two, you're out there at the scene. You're seeing this firsthand. That's the kind of trauma, Tommy, that you don't get over. You don't forget that. You can't forget that. Even after a successful conviction, those things stay with you.
There's no doubt. And I would often go, I tried primarily murder cases, and you're right. I was the elected DA, but I was a working DA, and so I had often gone to scenes, but this time I went because if you think about it, the precursor to locate this 9 days, we had never seen any media experience like that. The intensity, that we, is fairly commonplace now, but then, and I knew, I went down that night, I knew that I needed to keep myself reminded of why I was doing what I do. Why I was going forward with the case, because I always actually consider the case a loss because I sought the death penalty, and then the jury gave her life. But I wanted to remember seeing those boys and seeing that circumstance. And, it's like a crime scene. It's one thing to show a jury pictures, but like the Murdoch case, they actually went out to the house. If you go to a scene, you remember the sights and sounds and smells. And I remember grown men, tough men and women that I'd worked with in state law enforcement crying their eyes out because everybody just held such hope. It sounds so cliche. You hear it all the time, but Michael and Alex became everyone's children, and so um,
Yeah.
it did stick with me probably as much, and in my career, we've dug bodies up and, found horrible homicide scenes, but, as my law enforcement career, but it was almost a little self-inflicted, but it had to happen to keep me focused and on to do the job I needed to do.
And, it's children. It's different. To your point, everybody can envision it being their own children. It's a whole different thing, especially when a mother does this to her children. Let's talk about that sentence because we know that the jury did spare her the death penalty. They sentenced her to life in prison. And then for me, even more surprising at the time was the possibility of parole. Did you talk with the jury after, or do you have any insight? Because this, to me, if you're going to have the death penalty in any case, this is that case.
I always explain to people that I'm not the yin to the anti-death penalty crowd yang. I don't wake up going, woohoo, I get to seek the death penalty. But I agree with you, Judge, that whatever the ultimate punishment available, she deserved it. And the approach I took in that regard is if the black man had done it, there would be a hue and cry for the death penalty. If David Smith had done it, the father, pretty much the same thing. So my approach was I can't treat Susan different just because she reminds us of our sister or coworker or spouse or whatever the case. Because like you alluded to, in a bigger sense, it's a greater betrayal than otherwise. But the jury actually wondered or whether life meant life. And under South Carolina law back then, the judge had to instruct you take life and death in its plain and usual meaning. There were court cases that basically said you didn't want them speculating on if and when parole would happen. Fortunately, in South Carolina, either the next year, so I tried it in 95, I think it was either 95 or 96, life became life. Which I always saw as an irony because the next case I tried after that, the same attorneys, the death penalty attorneys, fought, and they said, the jury has a right to know everything. And I'm thinking a year ago, I wanted the jury to know everything, as far as life meaning life or not. Because obviously, if life really does mean life, there's a good argument that that's punishment. And actually, what you talk about afterwards, one of the jurors said, well, she'll have to sit in prison and think about what she did, and be remorseful the rest of her life. Unfortunately, based on her conduct in prison, you can see that Susan's remorse is to Susan's circumstances, not what happened to Michael and Alex.
Yeah, and, I wanna talk a little bit about that because, apparently she still had that lustful disposition, she had sex with guards, she exchanged letters with men who promised her homes, money, and affection, and she courted attention, I think, from not just the media and journalists, but also from so-called sugar daddies, so, I think that this has always been her driving force, Tommy.
And Judge, we look back and I always say everybody then that ultimately comes in the back of the courtroom, probably the attorneys too. Everybody's got baggage. Everybody's got mental issues that have created certain things, and whatever set her on that course, she has been sexualized. Kind of from youth. I don't know, her stepfather, she had relations with her stepfather. And again, I'm not condoning that, but she's 16 years old or so when she came into that household. She's a young woman, but she, likes to jump on his lap. And again, not condoning their relationship continued even up
Right.
into the month or the weeks right before the boys were killed. And so she, again, not condoning sexual assault in any way, shape, or form, but she continued those acts after she was an emancipated adult. Also had sex, obviously, with Tom Finley and had sex with Tom Finley's father that owned the factory. And so, what do you call it, promiscuous or, like I said, we're all in the DSM somewhere, me included. But um,
Sure, sure.
I get it whether it was histrionic or I can't remember the diagnosis, but she's either the princess or the victim. Matter of fact, when the SLED agents during the investigation were driving her back and forth, like for polygraphs or to meet with the other officers, one of my friends from SLED that was driving her said she was flirting with him, talking about, oh, it's a beautiful day. I wish you and I were going to the beach together. She's used her sexuality um, as her tool and unfortunately as her downfall.
Right, as her downfall because it did turn murderous. I mean, it's and I agree with you. Listen, we all have our stuff. We all have our stuff, and with age, I get wisdom, so I can usually wouldn't say it on a podcast, but can usually tell you what my stuff is, right? But when you hear it go to such an extreme of someone yeah, right? It's someone killing her own children. It's just unfathomable. All right, I've taken lots of your time, but we have to talk about parole. As I understand the statistics, in South Carolina, parole is only granted about 8% of the time. And when Susan Smith went up before the parole board, again, as I understand it, it would take a 2/3 vote from the board. We know that she was not granted parole. We know that you were there and you spoke. Tell us about that.
Sure. So I always or tell people that my victims, like David Smith, for example, I always love to hear from them, but I always go out of my way not to contact them because I represent such a horrible time in their life and I don't want to reopen a wound. But, from time to time over the years, I've heard from David. It got close to this. He asked, would I come? And certainly I would do anything to support him. So yeah, it was difficult that day. We had to be there early. We went about 9 and it probably didn't the actual hearing take place to about noon. So in other words, about 3 hours they were having time maybe getting Susan. She was there by video or whatever. So I told someone that it reminded me of funeral visitation. You know how you go in and you visit somebody and you tell them that they're in your prayers and kind of my style is always I want them to know I cared enough to come, and also then I'll say something funny, just to kind of lighten the mood. And I said, with David, it was like funeral visitation for 3 hours. We'd laugh and we'd cry. He's got a daughter now that's 21 and he has a son, and my daughter's 21. So I brought my daughter to meet him. So that part was, actually a positive, but, then we'd roll back into while we were there. And I will tell you, I did not realize some of the things that David had gone through over the years that he shared with the parole board, including that he had gone to Michael's Alex grave with an intent of taking his own life with the pistol. He had gone to John D. Long Lake in the past and thought about rolling himself into the lake because he feels such a strong bond with those boys. And so, it goes back to what you and I talk about cases or look at cases every day. And we're probably a little numb, you for being on the bench, me in the courtroom, and you don't recognize that it does linger and it continues to affect people. And I had a long talk with David and his wife Tiffany, and I think, but for his faith, and he'll be the first to tell you, God has seen him through this, but for his faith, and he still has, good days and bad days and counseling. But the bottom line is, unfortunately, in South Carolina, Susan will be back up every 2 years. And so every 2 years that Dave Smith wants to go, well, he not wants to go, he'll be there. I'll be there with him.
That's an amazing, it's the whole thing is amazing. And I just have to thank you. I mean, we can add levity and joke all day long, but the reality is you do God's work in your service when you serve as a prosecutor. You do. And the success, okay, no death penalty, but the success in having her convicted, which obviously is the right end to this, and your willingness to go back. Because I just want to point out, you are not currently the elected solicitor, which is the DA in your state. So you do not have to go back. You're choosing to do that to support David and based on your experience with this case as the prosecutor. I can't thank you enough, Tommy. It's a tough case, and I think all of America remembers it because you're right. It was front and center at a time when we didn't have social media. We didn't have YouTube. We didn't have ways to follow what was going on all over the world every 3 seconds. And so it will haunt me, to be honest, forever. Any last thoughts about this case?
I was just thinking how it did mesh, and I think the nature of your podcast and unique, the seven deadly. I think lust did. I'd mesh lust with self-centeredness and selfishness because lust is given over to the flesh for whatever the cost, so to speak. And I think that's exactly what happened here. She gave over to her lustful needs. Over everybody, over David, over Michael and Alex, over the community. Susan put Susan first and apparently continues to do so.
And I was going to say, I think she always will. I do not believe that will change. It's almost like a child predator and never changes. I think the same of Susan Smith. Tommy Pope, thank you so, so much.
Yep. Glad to be with you. Thank you.